The confessional had always been a place of comfort for me, a small wooden booth tucked into the corner of St. Michael's Church, where the dim light filtered through the stained glass, casting colors onto the walls like muted whispers. For years, I had sat on the other side of that confessional screen, listening to the murmured secrets, the quiet admissions of sin, the burdened sighs of those who sought forgiveness. It was a routine, a part of my life as natural as breathing. I would listen, offer absolution, and watch as the penitents left, their shoulders a little less heavy, their steps a bit lighter. It gave me a sense of purpose, a belief that I was doing something good, something necessary. But there was something else too, a part of me that I rarely acknowledged, not even to myself. It was the way I felt a slight, almost imperceptible swell of pride each time I pronounced the words of forgiveness. It was subtle, a quiet thrill at knowing that I was the conduit between these lost souls and their salvation. And then there was the other side of it, a darker, more insidious feeling that crept into my heart, a sense of superiority. I was not like them. I was not weak, not burdened by the same sins, the same failings. I was above it all, clean and righteous, a shepherd guiding his flock, immune to the temptations that plagued them. I never spoke of this, of course. How could I? I was a man of God, sworn to humility and service, yet inside me brewed this silent contradiction. I would watch as people shuffled into the confessional, their hands trembling, their voices hushed, and I would think to myself how small they seemed, how feeble in their struggles. There was a quiet judgment, a part of me that reveled in their weakness because it made me feel strong. It was a secret I kept locked away, buried deep beneath layers of sermons, prayers, and holy duties. It was a Tuesday morning, just like any other. I had just finished morning mass, and the church was quiet, the kind of stillness that only sacred places seem to hold. I had gone back to my small office, planning to spend a few hours catching up on correspondence and preparing my sermon for Sunday. But as I sat down at my desk, a sudden wave of nausea washed over me, followed by a sharp stabbing pain in my chest. It was so sudden, so intense, that for a moment I thought it was just a spasm, a momentary discomfort. I tried to breathe through it, but the pain didn't ease. Instead it grew, spreading across my chest, down my left arm, a cold, numbing sensation that made my fingers tingle. I stood up, gripping the edge of the desk, trying to steady myself. I told myself it was nothing, just stress or maybe something I ate. But as the minutes passed, the pain became unbearable, a crushing weight pressing down on my chest, as if some unseen force was squeezing the life out of me. I stumbled out of the office, trying to make my way to the door, to call for help, but my legs felt heavy, unresponsive. The world around me blurred, the edges of my vision darkening, and I knew with a sudden terrifying clarity that I was having a heart attack. I fell to my knees, gasping, clutching at my chest as though I could somehow claw the pain away. I tried to pray, to call out to God, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think of was the cold, the darkness that was slowly creeping in, swallowing me whole. My head swam, and the last thing I remember was the floor rushing up to meet me, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling my ears, and then, nothing. It's strange how time works in moments like that. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but it felt like an eternity and yet no time at all. There was a moment of absolute stillness, a silence so deep it felt like I was suspended in a void, and then slowly I became aware of a light. It was faint at first, a distant glow that seemed to pulse, growing brighter, drawing me toward it. I remember thinking that it looked like the light that filtered through the stained glass in the church, soft and warm, but it wasn't coming from anywhere I could see. It was just there, all around me, enveloping me. As I moved closer to the light, I felt a strange sensation, as though I was floating weightless, detached from my body. I could see myself, lying there on the floor of my office, my face pale, my lips tinged blue, and I knew that I was dying. But there was no fear, no panic, just a calm, detached acceptance, as if this was something that had been waiting for me all along, and now it had come to claim me. I felt the light pulling me, drawing me away from my earthly form, and for a moment, I wanted to surrender to it, to let go and drift away into that endless, soothing glow. But then something changed. The light dimmed, flickered, and I felt a chill run through me, a cold so intense it made my very soul shiver. I looked around, and the light was still there, but it was no longer warm, no longer comforting. It had taken on a harsh, almost clinical brightness, like the glare of a surgical lamp, and the shadows it cast were deep and twisted, stretching out in impossible angles. I tried to move, to turn away from the light, but I couldn't. I was trapped, suspended in that cold, blinding glow, and then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, echoing from somewhere in the darkness. "You think you are better than them, don't you? The words were like a knife, cutting through the silence, sharp and accusing. I tried to speak, to deny it, but my mouth wouldn't move. I could feel the words choking in my throat, as though something was holding them back, forcing me to confront the accusation. The voice came again, louder this time, and I could feel it reverberating through me, shaking me to my core. All those years, sitting in that booth, passing judgment, pretending to be their savior. You are no better than them. You are a liar, a hypocrite. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but deep down, I knew the voice was right. It was as if it had reached into the darkest part of me, the part one had tried so hard to hide, and pulled it out into the open. I could see it now, all the moments when I had looked down on those who came to me for guidance, all the times I had reveled in their weakness because it made me feel strong. I had convinced myself that I was helping them, that I was doing God's work, but it was all a lie, a mask I wore to hide my own flaws, my own fears. As the voice continued, the light around me grew harsher, colder, and I could see shadows swirling in the darkness, shapes that seemed to writhe and twist, like figures struggling to break free. I could hear them too, faint whispers, echoes of the confessions I had heard over the years, each one a reminder of the sins I had so easily judged. The words mingled together, a cacophony of guilt and shame, and I felt as if they were suffocating me, pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. You have been blind, the voice said, softer now, almost pitying. Blind to your own sins, blind to the truth. But you will see. You will see everything. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pain in my chest returned, sharp and unforgiving, tearing me away from that cold, accusing light. I felt my body convulse, my heart stuttering, and for a moment, I thought I was dying, that this was the end. But instead of the darkness swallowing me, I felt something shift, a jolt that sent me hurtling back toward the warmth of my body, back to the floor of my office, where I lay gasping for air, the cold tile pressing against my cheek. I opened my eyes, and I was back in the world I had known, but everything was different. The room was the same, the familiar scent of incense still lingering in the air, but I could feel the weight of what I had experienced, the truth that had been forced upon me. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, deeply afraid, not of death, but of what it meant to live. The days after the incident were a blur of hospital rooms, beeping machines, and worried faces. I had been rushed to the emergency room, my heart barely clinging to life, and the doctors had worked quickly to stabilize me. They said it was a miracle that I had survived, that someone had found me just in time, but to me, it felt less like a miracle and more like a reprieve, a temporary postponement of a fate I couldn't escape. As I lay there, staring up at the sterile white ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about the voice and the cold, unyielding light. It haunted me, creeping into my thoughts even when I tried to push it away. The doctors told me that I had suffered a severe heart attack, and that I was lucky to be alive. They kept me in the hospital for several days, running tests, monitoring my heart, making sure that there were no lasting effects. But there was something else, something they couldn't see, couldn't measure with their machines. I felt it, like a shadow that had latched onto me, clinging to the edges of my consciousness, a darkness that I couldn't shake. I didn't tell anyone about it. How could I? How could I explain the cold voice, the terrible accusations, the feeling that I had been stripped bare, my soul laid out for judgment? When I was finally discharged, they told me to rest, to take it easy, to avoid stress. I nodded, thanked them, and left the hospital, but inside, I felt a turmoil that no amount of rest could ease. I returned to the rectory, to the familiar surroundings of the church, hoping that being back in the place that had always given me comfort would calm the storm inside me. But it didn't. The moment I stepped through the doors of St. Michael's, I felt a strange sense of unease, as if the walls themselves were whispering, echoing the words that had been spoken to me in that otherworldly place. I tried to resume my duties, but nothing felt right. The church was the same, the confessional booth was the same, even the faces of my parishioners were the same, but I was different. I could see it in the way they looked at me, in the polite smiles and concerned glances they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. They knew something had changed, even if they didn't understand what it was. And how could they? How could they know that every time I stepped into the confessional, I heard that voice again, low and accusatory, whispering in the back of my mind, reminding me of all the times I had sat there, judging, pretending to be righteous, when in truth, I was no better than the rest of them. One evening, as I was closing up the church, I found myself standing in front of the confessional, staring at the wooden door. I didn't know how long I had been standing there, just that I couldn't bring myself to step inside. My heart was pounding, a slow, heavy thud that echoed in my ears, and I could feel the darkness creeping in around the edges of my vision, just like it had on that day. It was as if the confessional itself had become a doorway, a portal back to that place of cold, harsh light, and I was afraid of what would happen if I stepped through it. But I couldn't avoid it forever. The next Sunday, the church was full, the pews packed with people who had come for Mass, and as the service ended, I saw them lining up by the confessional, waiting for their turn to unburden their souls. I knew I had to face it, that I couldn't keep running, so I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and walked over to the booth. I slid the door shut behind me, the familiar creak of the hinges sounding like a sigh, and I sat down, closing my eyes for a moment to collect myself. The first penitent entered, a young woman I recognized, one of the regulars who often came to confess minor sins, small transgressions that weighed on her more than they should. She spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper, and I listened, nodding, offering the usual words of comfort and absolution. But as she spoke, I could feel it again, that cold presence, the voice whispering in my mind, mocking me, taunting me. Liar. Hypocrite. Do you think these words mean anything? I tried to ignore it, to focus on what she was saying, but the voice grew louder, drowning out her words until all I could hear was that cruel, mocking tone. I don't know how I managed to finish the confession, but as soon as she left, I bolted out of the booth, my hands shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but the voice was still there, echoing in my head, relentless. It wasn't just the words, but the feeling that came with them, a sense of being watched, judged, as though there were eyes on me, unseen but all-knowing, and they saw everything, every flaw, every weakness, every sin I had ever tried to hide. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. I barely slept, haunted by dreams of that cold, bright light, of shadows twisting and writhing, of voices whispering in the darkness. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a moment, I would think I was still there, still trapped in that place. I began to avoid the confessional, making excuses, finding reasons to be elsewhere whenever someone asked for confession. I told myself it was just temporary, that I needed time to recover, but deep down, I knew it was fear. Fear of what I would hear, of what I would see if I allowed myself to slip back into that place, even for a moment. But I couldn't escape it. One night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, I felt the familiar chill wash over me, and I knew what was coming. I closed my eyes, bracing myself, but it didn't help. The room seemed to fade around me, the shadows growing deeper, until I was no longer in my bedroom but somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold, where the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, a presence, vast and malevolent, surrounding me, closing in. And then I heard it again, the voice clear and cold, as if it were speaking directly into my ear. You cannot hide from the truth. You cannot hide from yourself. I turned, trying to see where the voice was coming from, but there was nothing, just darkness, stretching out endlessly in every direction. What do you want from me? I shouted, my voice sounding small and hollow in the vast emptiness. What do you want me to do? There was a pause, a silence so deep it was suffocating, and then the voice spoke again, but this time it was different, softer, almost gentle. I want you to see. The darkness began to shift, swirling around me, and I could see shapes forming, vague at first, then clearer, until I realized I was looking at faces. Hundreds of faces, familiar faces, the faces of the people who had come to me over the years, seeking forgiveness, seeking solace. They stared at me, their eyes wide, unblinking, and I could see the pain, the fear, the guilt in their expressions. They were the faces of my parishioners, but there was something wrong, something distorted about them, as if they were caught in a perpetual state of suffering. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was like they were holding me there, forcing me to see, to confront the reality I had tried so hard to ignore. And then, slowly, the faces began to change, morphing into something else. They became my face, my own eyes staring back at me, but filled with the same pain, the same fear. I could see myself, not as I had always imagined, but as I truly was, stripped of all pretense, all the lies I had told myself. I was no different from them. I was just as flawed, just as lost, and the realization hit me with the force of a blow, knocking the breath out of me. The voice spoke again, and this time, it was almost kind, as if it understood my pain, my fear. You have hidden behind your robes, behind your words, but the truth has always been there, waiting for you. You cannot escape it. I wanted to protest, to deny it, but I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, and I could feel the tears stinging my eyes, hot and bitter. What do you want me to do? I whispered, my voice breaking. How do I make it stop? The light flared bright and blinding, and I had to close my eyes against it, but even then I could still see it, burning through my eyelids. "You must face it," the voice said, its tone soft but firm. "You must face yourself, your sins, your fears, and only then will you find peace." I wanted to scream, to beg, to plead for it to end, but I knew there was no escape. I had to see, to confront the truth I had been running from, and as the light grew brighter, I felt it burning through me, stripping away everything, until there was nothing left but the raw, naked truth. I don't know how long I was there, trapped in that erring light, but when it finally faded, I found myself back in my bed, the darkness of the room closing in around me. My heart was pounding, my skin clammy with sweat, and I could still hear the echo of the voice, the final words it had spoken, lingering in my mind. "You must see, you must face the truth, or it will consume you." I lay there, gasping, my mind reeling, and for the first time, I understood what it meant. It wasn't just about my sins, my failings. It was about everything I had built my life around, everything I had believed, everything I had told myself to keep the darkness at bay. I realized then that the truth wasn't something I could hide from, something I could bury under rituals and prayers. It was there waiting for me, demanding to be seen, and until I faced it, I would never find peace. I didn't know how to do it, didn't know if I had the strength, but I knew one thing: I couldn't keep running. The darkness was there, and it would not rest until I confronted it, until I found the courage to face myself, to see who I truly was. The days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and heavy, oppressive thoughts. Each time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by the voice, by the faces twisted in anguish, by the searing light that had stripped me bare. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. I avoided the church as much as I could, retreating into my room, but even there, the darkness followed me. It was as if I was being watched constantly, a pair of unseen eyes tracking my every movement, waiting for me to confront the truth I was so desperately trying to avoid. One evening, after yet another restless night, I decided to leave the rectory. I had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to escape, to find some kind of solace, even if it was just for a moment. I walked through the empty streets, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, and found myself at the park near the church. It was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost suffocating. I sat down on a bench, my hands trembling, and looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible through the city lights, and for a moment, I felt a pang of longing, a wish to disappear into that vast, infinite darkness and leave everything behind. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I felt a strange sensation, a warmth that began to spread through my chest, soft and gentle, like a hand resting on my heart. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but the park was empty. Then I heard it, a voice, but not the cold, accusing voice that had haunted me. This voice was different, softer, soothing, almost like a melody. "You are not alone," it said, and the words sent a shiver down my spine, not out of fear, but because they felt like a lifeline, something I could hold onto in the midst of the darkness. I wanted to believe it, wanted to trust in the comfort those words offered, but a part of me resisted, still clinging to the fear, the guilt that had consumed me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no answer, only a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves, but the warmth in my chest grew stronger, as if someone was embracing me, holding me close. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a flicker of peace, a small, fragile spark of hope. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I opened my eyes, the park was bathed in a soft, golden light. It wasn't coming from the streetlights or the moon, it was something else, something ethereal. And then I saw her. She stood a few feet away, bathed in that gentle glow, her presence calm and serene. She wasn't like any angel I had ever imagined. There were no wings, no halo, but there was a grace about her, a sense of peace that seemed to radiate from her very being. Her eyes were kind, and when she looked at me, I felt as if she could see everything, every fear, every doubt, every flaw, and yet she didn't turn away. "You're hurting," she said softly, and her voice was like a balm, soothing the raw, jagged edges of my soul. "You've been carrying this pain for so long, and it's eating away at you." I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I was fine, that I didn't need help, but the words wouldn't come. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, hot and bitter, and I tried to blink them away, but they spilled over, streaking down my cheeks. "I don't know what to do," I said finally, my voice cracking. "I've tried to be good, tried to do what's right, but nothing makes sense anymore. I feel like I'm losing myself." She nodded, as if she understood, and stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. You've been trying to live by rules, by rituals, but you've forgotten why you're doing it. You've forgotten the love, the compassion that lies at the heart of it all. Her words cut through me, not like a knife, but like a gentle probing touch, peeling back the layers I had built around myself. I don't understand, I said, shaking my head. I've always done what I was supposed to do. I followed the rules, said the prayers, given the sermons. Isn't that enough? She smiled, and it was a sad, knowing smile, as if she had heard those words 1,000 times before. Faith isn't about following rules, she said. It's about understanding, about love. You've been so focused on being righteous, on being perfect, that you've lost sight of what truly matters. You've judged yourself and others by a standard that no one can meet, and it's blinded you to the truth. I felt something inside me break, a dam that had been holding back a flood of emotions, and suddenly I was crying, the tears flowing freely, as if years of pent-up guilt and fear were finally being released. I don't know how to change, I said, my voice choked with sobs. I don't know how to be better. She stepped closer, and this time, she placed her hand on mine, her touch warm and steady. You don't have to be perfect, she said gently. You just have to be honest, with yourself and with others. You've been hiding behind your role, behind your duties, but it's time to let that go. It's time to see yourself for who you truly are, and to forgive yourself. I looked up at her, and in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: understanding, acceptance. It wasn't the harsh, judging light that had haunted me, but a soft, warm glow, a reminder that even in my darkest moments, I was not beyond redemption. But how? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. How do I find that forgiveness? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took my hands in hers and held them, her grip firm but gentle. By letting go, she said. By understanding that you are loved, even in your imperfection. You've been so afraid of your own flaws, of your own darkness, that you've forgotten that love doesn't demand perfection. It embraces it, even when it's messy, even when it hurts. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt as if everything had stopped, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't know if I could believe her, didn't know if I could let go of the fear, the guilt, the need to be in control. But as I stood there, looking into her eyes, I felt something shift inside me, a small but significant change, like a door opening just a crack, letting in a sliver of light. I don't know if I can, I said, my voice trembling. I don't know if I'm strong enough. She smiled again, and this time there was no sadness, only warmth, only light. You don't have to be, she said. You're not alone. There is strength in vulnerability, in admitting that you need help. It's okay to ask for it, to reach out. That's what love is. It's not about being strong all the time. It's about finding the courage to be weak, to be open, and to let others in. The warmth in her words, in her presence, began to seep into me, melting away the cold, rigid fear that had kept me locked in place. I felt my shoulders relax, the tightness in my chest easing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I took a deep breath, a breath that filled my lungs, my heart, my very soul. It felt like I was breathing in light, breathing in life. She let go of my hands, but the warmth remained, a gentle, steady pulse that seemed to echo inside me. You've been given a gift, she said, a chance to see things differently, to understand what it means to truly live, to truly love. It's not an easy path, but it's a path worth taking. And you don't have to walk it alone. I looked at her, this stranger, this angel, and felt a surge of gratitude, of hope. Thank you, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know who you are, but thank you. She stepped back, the light around her beginning to fade, but before she disappeared, she looked at me one last time, her eyes bright, clear. I am the love that has always been there, she said. The love that waits for you to see, to accept, and to believe. And I will always be with you, even when you cannot see me. And then she was gone, the park dark and quiet once more, but the warmth, the light she had left behind, stayed with me. I sat there alone, but for the first time, I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel afraid. I knew I had a long way to go, that there would be more struggles, more darkness, but I also knew that there was light, that there was love, and that I wasn't alone. As I stood up and began to walk back to the church, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. I had been given a glimpse of something beautiful, something pure, and I knew that I had to find a way to carry that light with me, to share it, to let it guide me through whatever lay ahead. The darkness was still there, lurking at the edges, but it didn't frighten me anymore. I had seen the light, and I knew that as long as I kept moving forward, as long as I kept seeking, I would find my way. Returning to the rectory that night, I felt like a different man. The world outside was the same, the streetlights flickering, the distant hum of traffic, the cool air brushing against my skin, but something inside me had shifted. I could still feel the warmth from that encounter, the gentle, steady pulse of light that seemed to guide my steps, and it filled me with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, I could see the path ahead, not as a straight line or a set of rules to follow, but as something living, breathing, open to change and growth. But when I walked into the church the next morning, that sense of peace was quickly overshadowed by the familiar weight of routine. The faces of my parishioners greeted me, their expressions kind but cautious, as if they could sense that something was different, something they couldn't quite understand. I moved through the motions of the morning, shaking hands, offering polite smiles, but inside, a storm was brewing. I wanted to tell them what had happened, to share the light I had found, but I didn't know where to begin. How could I explain something so profound, so intimate, to people who looked to me for certainty, for answers? The service that Sunday felt like a test, a fragile balance between the old me, the priest who delivered his sermons with authority, who spoke of sin and redemption in clear, unyielding terms, and the new me, who had glimpsed a deeper truth, a truth that didn't fit neatly into the words I had used for so long. As I stood at the pulpit, looking out at the congregation, I realized that I could no longer preach the way I used to. The words felt hollow, like an echo of something that had once been true but no longer was. I stumbled through the readings, my voice faltering, and I could see the confusion in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other, as if wondering what was wrong. After the service, a few of them approached me, asking if I was okay, if I needed to rest. I assured them I was fine, but their concern only deepened the ache inside me. I wanted to tell them everything, to lay it all out in the open, but the fear held me back. What would they think if they knew that their priest, the one they had trusted for so many years, had been living a lie, had been hiding behind a mask of piety and certainty? I could feel the old habits creeping back, the need to keep up appearances, to maintain control, and it terrified me. As the week went on, I found myself retreating more and more, avoiding the confessional, making excuses to skip meetings and gatherings. I spent hours in my office, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of everything. The warmth I had felt that night in the park was still there, but it was flickering, as if struggling to stay alive against the tide of doubt and fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I prayed, but the prayers felt different, not the rote recitations I had grown so accustomed to, but desperate, searching pleas for guidance, for strength to do what I knew I had to do. One afternoon, as I was sitting alone in the sanctuary, I heard a voice behind me. "Father, can I speak with you?" I turned to see a young man, one of the newer members of the congregation, standing in the doorway. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting at his sides, and I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "Of course," I said, gesturing for him to sit. He took a seat in the pew across from me, and for a moment there was silence, the kind of silence that stretches on, heavy with unspoken words. "I'm not sure how to say this," he began, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I've been coming here for a few months now, and I've always felt safe, I guess. Like this was a place where I could find peace. But lately, I've been struggling. I feel lost, and I don't know who to talk to. I thought maybe you could help." I listened, my heart aching with recognition. His words mirrored my own feelings, the same sense of being lost, adrift, unable to find solid ground. "I'm glad you came to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not easy to admit when we're struggling, but it's the first step towards finding clarity. What's been troubling you?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how to explain it. It's like I'm trying to be a good person, to do what's right, but no matter what I do, it doesn't feel like enough. I come here, I pray, I listen to your sermons, but there's this emptiness inside me, and I don't know how to fill it." As he spoke, I felt a familiar pang, a reminder of all the times I had felt the same way, even when I was the one delivering those sermons. I took a deep breath, and before I could stop myself, I began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I understand what you're feeling. More than you know. I felt that emptiness too, that sense that no matter how hard I try, it's never enough. I've spent years hiding it, pretending I had all the answers, but the truth is, I don't. I'm just as lost as you are." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I was terrified. What had I just done? I had laid bare my own doubts, my own fears to this young man, and now he would see me for what I truly was, a fraud, a hypocrite. But when I looked at him, I didn't see judgment. I saw relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly. I thought I was the only one. It was a simple statement, but it broke something open inside me, a barrier I hadn't even realized was there. For so long, I had been afraid to admit my own weaknesses, my own humanity, because I thought it would make me unworthy, unfit to be a priest. But in that moment, I realized that it was precisely in admitting those flaws, in being honest about my struggles, that I could truly connect with others, truly help them. The light I had felt that night in the park, the warmth that had carried me through those dark days, wasn't about being perfect. It was about being open, about letting go of the need to control everything and allowing myself to be vulnerable. Over the next few weeks, I began to change the way I approached my role. I still led the services, still offered guidance, but I no longer pretended to have all the answers. When people came to me for confession, I listened, not with the detached authority I had once wielded, but with empathy, with understanding. I shared my own struggles, my own doubts, not because I wanted their pity, but because I wanted them to know they weren't alone. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old habits, the old fears, crept back in, whispering that I was making a mistake, that I was exposing myself to ridicule, to rejection. But each time, I reminded myself of the light, of the gentle voice that had told me I was loved, even in my imperfection. Not everyone understood. Some members of the congregation began to pull away, uncomfortable with the changes they saw in me. They wanted the old priest back, the one who spoke with certainty, who could tell them what to do and how to live without hesitation. I could see the disappointment in their eyes, the way they avoided me, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. There were whispers, rumors that I was having some kind of crisis, that I wasn't fit to lead anymore. I knew I could try to go back to the way things were, to play the role they wanted me to play, but I also knew that if I did, I would be betraying everything I had learned, everything I had felt in that moment of light. One evening, as I was preparing to leave the church, I found a note slipped under my office door. It was from an older woman, one of the parishioners who had been attending the church for as long as I could remember. She had always been polite, but distant, never one to engage much beyond the formalities. I unfolded the note, my heart pounding, and read her words. "Father, I've been coming to this church for 20 years, and I've heard a lot of sermons, a lot of words. But it wasn't until recently that I felt like someone was truly listening. I don't know what changed, but I want you to know that it matters. It matters more than you can imagine. Thank you." I read the note over and over, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. It wasn't a grand gesture, wasn't a declaration of faith or a confession of sin, but it was real. It was honest. And in that moment, I understood what the angel had meant when she said I wasn't alone. I didn't need to have all the answers, didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to be there, to be present, to listen, and that was enough. The road ahead was still uncertain. I knew there would be more challenges, more doubts, more whispers. But for the first time, I felt like I was walking it with my eyes open, with my heart open. I wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't pretending to be something I wasn't. I was simply a man, flawed and imperfect, trying to find his way, and that was okay. It was more than okay, it was enough. As I locked the church doors that night and stepped out into the cool evening air, I looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible through the haze of the city, but they were there, small points of light in the darkness. I took a deep breath, feeling the chill of the air fill my lungs, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The light was still there, flickering, fragile, but it was real. It was something I could hold on to, something I could share, and that was all I needed. I knew now that the journey wasn't about reaching some final perfect state of enlightenment or grace. It was about learning to live with the imperfections, with the doubts and fears, and still finding a way to love, to hope, to believe. It was about seeing the light, not as something distant and unattainable, but as something that existed within me, within everyone, even in our darkest moments. And as long as I could see that, as long as I could hold on to it, I knew I would be okay. The months that followed were a slow, steady journey toward something new, something that I was still learning how to name. I had always thought of faith as a set of rules, a path laid out with clear instructions, but now I understood that it was more like a dance, sometimes graceful, sometimes stumbling, always in motion. I wasn't leading anymore, not in the way I had once believed a priest should. I was listening, responding, letting the moments guide me rather than forcing them into a shape that fit my expectations. I started small, opening up the church at odd hours, leaving the doors unlocked so that anyone who needed a quiet space could find it. I set up a few chairs in a circle in one of the side rooms, and after each Mass, I would stay behind, just in case anyone wanted to talk or pray, or simply sit in silence with someone beside them. At first, people were hesitant. They weren't used to seeing me in this way, weren't sure how to approach me now that I had let my guard down. But slowly, they began to come. A young mother who had lost her husband, a man struggling with addiction, a teenager who felt out of place in the world. They came, and I listened, not with answers, but with understanding, with empathy. One evening, a few weeks after I had begun this new practice, a group of about 5 people gathered in the room, none of them knowing each other, all of them brought together by a shared quiet need. We sat there, not saying much at first, just letting the silence fill the space. Then slowly they began to talk. They spoke about their fears, their regrets, the things that kept them awake at night. It wasn't like the confessions I was used to, those hurried, whispered admissions in the dark of the confessional booth. This was different. It was honest, raw, and as they spoke, I could see them begin to relax, to soften, as if the simple act of being heard was lifting a weight from their shoulders. "I don't know why it helps," one of them said, a middle-aged man with a tired, worn face. "But it does. Just being here with all of you. It makes it feel like I'm not alone." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "That's because you're not," I said softly. "None of us are." It was such a simple thing to say, but it carried so much truth. I had spent so many years trying to be a pillar, a rock that people could lean on, but I had never truly let myself be vulnerable, had never allowed others to see me as anything other than the role I played. Now, I understood that it wasn't about being strong, about having all the answers. It was about being present, about sharing the burden, even if that meant admitting my own weaknesses, my own doubts. Word began to spread. More people came, not just for Mass, but for the gatherings afterward, and sometimes we would sit for hours, talking, listening, laughing, crying. I could feel something shifting, not just within myself, but within the community. The rigid, formal lines that had once defined my relationship with them began to blur, to soften. I was no longer just their priest, I was one of them, a fellow traveler on the same uncertain path. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if I was leading people astray by stepping away from the strict, traditional role I had been taught to fill. Some members of the congregation were uncomfortable with the changes, and a few stopped coming altogether. They wanted the certainty, the clear lines between right and wrong, and I could no longer provide that. But for each person who left, there were others who stayed, who found something they hadn't realized they were looking for, a sense of connection, of belonging, of being seen for who they truly were, flaws and all. One Sunday, as I was preparing for Mass, I received a letter from the diocesan office. My heart sank as I read it. They had heard about the changes I was making, about the way I was opening up the church, the gatherings, the shift in my sermons. There were concerns, they said, about whether I was adhering to doctrine, about whether I was still fit to lead. They wanted to meet, to discuss the direction I was taking and whether it aligned with the teachings of the church. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I had known this could happen, had known that stepping away from the traditional path might draw criticism, but seeing it there in black and white made it real in a way that I wasn't prepared for. For a moment, I considered canceling everything, going back to the old ways, just to keep the peace, to avoid the confrontation. But then I thought of the people who had come to those gatherings, who had found comfort in the space we had created together, and I knew I couldn't turn back. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, I tried to prepare myself. I prayed, not for strength or courage, but for clarity, for the ability to speak from my heart without fear. The day of the meeting, I walked into the diocesan office, my hand shaking, but there was a calmness beneath the anxiety, a quiet assurance that I hadn't felt before. The room was cold, sterile, and I could see the stern, expectant faces of the officials as they waited for me to speak. They asked me to explain myself, to justify the changes I had made, and as I began to speak, I felt the familiar fear rising, the urge to defend, to make excuses. But then I remembered the warmth of the gatherings, the light I had felt in the park that night, and I pushed the fear aside. "I know this isn't what you're used to," I said, my voice steady but soft. "And I understand if it doesn't make sense, if it feels like I'm stepping away from tradition. But what I've seen, what I've felt, is something that goes beyond doctrine, beyond rules. It's connection, it's love, And it's real. For the first time, I feel like I'm truly living my faith, not just preaching it. And I know that might not fit into the structure we've built, but it's brought people together, it's brought them hope, and I can't turn my back on that. There was a long silence after I finished, the kind of silence that stretches on, heavy with unspoken thoughts. I could see them weighing my words, trying to find a way to fit them into the framework they had always known. One of the officials, an older man with kind, tired eyes, leaned forward. "Faith isn't just about comfort, Father," he said. "It's about truth, about guiding people toward salvation. If we allow ourselves to bend, to soften the message, how can we be sure we're not leading them astray?" I took a deep breath, the words coming to me slowly, but with certainty. "I understand that," I said. "But I also believe that salvation isn't found in rigidity. It's found in love, in grace, in understanding. It's not about bending the truth, it's about making space for it, about letting it breathe." I've seen the way people respond when they feel heard, when they feel like they don't have to hide their pain, their struggles. And I believe that's where God is, in those moments of connection, of compassion. That's the truth I'm trying to share. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I had spoken my truth, and that was all I could do. They thanked me for my time, said they would consider what I had said, and I left the office feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted, even though I didn't know what the outcome would be. In the weeks that followed, I waited, not knowing if they would call me back, if they would ask me to step down. But as the days passed, I realized that I wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever happened, I would find a way to continue, because I had seen the light, had felt the warmth of connection, and I knew it was worth fighting for. And then one evening, I received another letter. This time, it was different. They had decided not to take any action, not to interfere. "We trust that you are acting with sincerity and with the best intentions," the letter said. "We will continue to observe, but we hope that your efforts bear fruit." It wasn't a complete endorsement, but it was enough. It was a chance to keep going, to keep building, and I was grateful for it. The gatherings continued, and more people began to come, not just from our parish, but from other parts of the city, drawn by the stories they had heard. And each time as I sat with them, as I listened, I felt the light grow stronger, felt it spread, not just within me, but in the hearts of those around me. I don't know what the future holds. There will always be challenges, always be doubts, but I've learned that faith isn't about knowing the path ahead. It's about walking it, even when you're unsure, even when it's difficult, because you believe in what lies at the end. I've seen people find hope, find strength in each other, and I know now that that's where God is, not in the rigid, unyielding rules, but in the space between us, in the love that binds us together. I still struggle, still have moments where I question myself, where I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'm living up to the light I've found. But I also know that it's okay to stumble, to fall, because each time, I find a way to rise again, to keep moving forward. I've learned to embrace the imperfections, to see them not as failures, but as part of the journey, as part of what makes us human. And so, I continue not as a perfect leader, not as someone who has all the answers, but as a man who is learning, who is trying, who is finding his way one step at a time. And in that, I've found peace. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of acceptance, of knowing that I am enough, that we are all enough, just as we are. The light that guided me through my darkest moments is still there, and now it shines not just for me, but for all of us, a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in our deepest struggles, we are never truly alone. And as long as I can keep that light burning, as long as I can help others find it, I will continue to walk this path, wherever it may lead.